What's going on, everyone? Today I'm here with Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Now, many of you have asked me to ask Dr. Robin to come on the show. I never heard of her before. I looked into her work and I was very impressed. So I want to ask her a lot of questions. And I also got people from Patreon to ask questions as well. If you haven't followed us on Patreon, please follow us there. Now, Dr. Robin, thank you for taking time out of your day for coming on the show.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right, now, Dr. Robin, there's just a few questions we have for you, and we definitely want to know. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm white, and that certainly has shaped my life pretty much from the time I opened my eyes. And part of being white is that I was taught not to see myself as having a race, not to see race as significant in any way. I mean, certainly somebody had race, but it wasn't me. And so pretty much late in life, I really realized the power of whiteness and how it shapes every moment of my life and my worldview. And I began to really examine it deeply and figure out, the fundamental question that drives my work is, what does it mean to be white in a society that says it doesn't mean anything and yet is profoundly separate and unequal by race? So that's what I devote my work to, is answering that question. How do white people pull that off? I'm sure you may have wondered yourself at times. How do we pull off this insistence that race has no meaning as we live, love, play, work in separation?
Correct. Now, I read that you grew up poor. So what motivated you to get your PhD?
Honestly, I was waiting tables and I was a single mom, and I looked ahead and I just didn't see any way out of that cycle without going to college. And I had always seen college as where the smart people went. And then I got here and I'm like, oh, this has nothing to do with that. This is all about access. But I did go to college late in life, and that's when this kind of exploration, upon graduation, I was looking for a job. And I got a job as a diversity trainer. And I really believed my qualifications were my open-minded liberalness, right? I was a vegetarian. So
Good.
I was totally qualified. And of course, that was the most profound learning of my life. That to realize in no way did my so-called open-mindedness prepare me to engage with any complexity or nuance in the most complex, nuanced social dilemma since the beginning of this country.
Okay, so you was a diversity trainer, but
Yep.
what made you really want to get into the field of racial and social justice education? I mean, did one event happen to you that you say, I gotta make a difference?
I thought it sounded very cool, right? Like, what an interesting job, But then when I got in, I was in so far over my head. I was being deeply challenged by people of color. And it was like the scales fell from my eyes, and I really can't see anything more meaningful. Because I had a very acute sense of what it is to be seen as less than. I mean, growing up in poverty and homelessness, and it was very humiliating. And I had a very deeply internalized sense of inferiority. And when I realized that I was actually colluding in somebody else's oppression, right? That while I might have been poor, I was still white, and that I benefited profoundly from that. That was unacceptable to me, to realize that I was participating in somebody else's pain and oppression through my obliviousness. And so that motivated me, right? Drawing from my own experience and having it help me see what it meant to be on the other side of that equation, right?
Correct. Now, I viewed a presentation where you described people in white America, they segregate. And so can you explain to us their need to segregate? Because you did a 20-minute presentation on this.
Ooh, well, first of all, we're born in segregation. Most white people live in segregation, and it's segregation that we choose. It's segregation that we've enforced through decades and decades of policies and practices. It's not a fluke. It's not benign. It's not just natural, right? And people of color have tried to integrate with us for a very, very, very long time. And in all kinds of ways, we prevent that, right? In the past, it was legal through processes like redlining and that kind of thing. It's not legal in the same way today, but we still pull it off through the way we fund schools and narratives about good schools and good neighborhoods. And we're taught as we grow up in these segregated environments that it's good, right? That where we live is good, that it's normal to live apart. So the fundamental message of segregation, which is the water most white people grow up in, is that there's really no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of color, right? I could go to my grave without really knowing people of color, right? Just following the way my parents raised me. You know, I'm not trying to do anything. I could go to my grave without knowing people of color, and not one person who's ever guided me in my life has suggested that was a loss. That's a very deep message. And that, of course, it's like a vicious cycle. I'm not particularly interested. And so I just reproduce that same separation that I was born into.
Now, there have been many stories, and I think we covered that story as well out of the Cal State LA, for instance, just not too long ago, about the safe spaces that some Black students are asking for on some of these college campuses due to racial tension and harassment. But the biggest critics of that have been white people. Why would you think, since you said they naturally segregate more than anybody else, well, I'm gonna say they segregate, I'm not gonna say more than anybody else. Why would they be the biggest critics when Black people say, well, maybe we just need to kind of move away from them just a little bit so we don't have to deal with this tension?
Because in those moments, it makes visible to white people a few things that we need to deny. So it makes whiteness visible, right? Suddenly, they're saying we don't want to be near white people, and I have to think about myself as a white person. And nothing in the society ever names my race, right? It names your race, but I get to just be a universal human being, right? I'm not ever kind of tagged in that way. And so in that moment, I have to look at that. It also invokes what I think is the most effective adaptation of racism post-civil rights, which is you made an either or proposition of good or bad, right? Racists are bad. And if I'm a good person and I'm against racism, I couldn't possibly be participating in racism. So now you say you want to separate from me to feel safe. Well, that must mean you must think I have some racist patterns, and now you have offended my character and my moral sense, right? So these are all these ways that we get conditioned to understand things that just beautifully set us up to hold all of this in place, right? To be very defensive and resistant. And it is always funny to me how most white people live in segregation every day. But when you name it in an intentional way, and you say, now we're going to separate by race in order to challenge racism, then we get very, very uncomfortable. Again, as long as it seems to just happen, rather than be the result of, again, decades of policies and practices, then I can reconcile my practices with my self-identity, right? I can reconcile how I actually live my life with what I profess to value, right? I profess to value diversity and inclusion, but I don't live my life that way in any way, right? I teach my children that everybody's equal, but I raise them separate from other people, right? And so you, in that little moment, you've held the mirror up to that, and white people can't handle it, right? It throws us off our game, if you will, what I call white fragility, and we respond very poorly to it.
Now, for a Black person, it frustrates me more than anything when you relating to that, because one minute you say we're the problem, we're the worst people ever, but yet when we say, well, let's go ahead on and get away from that, we, like in school, you have two children that can't get along. You try to solve the problem, you can't. So I say, well, if you guys can't solve your issues, then maybe I'll put you on one side of the class and you on the other side, and that's it. But it's just very frustrating for us to say we're the racist, which I don't know why we're the problem, that we want to get away from that. But this is the position that they put us in now.
Yes, yes. White folks are not in particularly good shape to have constructive conversations about racism, right? For all of these reasons. And so we have to, as part of the work towards reconciliation and coming together, there are times when we need to be separate to do the work that will put us in better shape when we come back together, right? There's all kinds of unconscious assumptions and microaggressions that white people perpetrate all the time. We don't mean to, but we just do as a result of the society we grow up in. And so there needs to be a time and place for us to work on that, so that when we do come together, it's not so hard on people of color, right? But again, we don't like that. Yeah. And I do need to say something about one of the other key pieces to this is that we're taught that racism consists of individual acts of meanness, right? That a racist doesn't like people of color and knows it. And so therefore, since I'm talking to you in a very friendly way, I couldn't possibly be racist, right? And we don't understand it as a system in which our bias is backed by legal authority and institutional control. And there's no way that I have avoided being, socialized into that system. And so I would not call what you do racist. I would call, because when I use that term, when social scientists use that term, they're very intentionally including institutional power and the weight of history behind that act. And to say that the weight of your bias towards me is equal to the weight of my bias towards you is to take power off the table, right? It's to render it meaningless. So dominant culture is very invested in this very single individual definition, which gets most white people off the hook, if that makes sense.
So basically what you're saying is, and I know there's a lot of, white people don't like this term. You're talking about the system of white supremacy.
Yes, I am. We live in a white supremacist society. And when I say that, I mean white as superior, white as ideal for humanity, right? White as the ideal norm for human, right? That's the water we live in. And when I do a presentation, I use a lot of images that surround us every day to make that visible. So I don't mean the KKK, and white folks who have a strong reaction to that word need to get up to date, right? It's being used today to recognize the society that we live in and not about intentional racists.
Now, when we use the term white privilege, and I've had white people tell me, I'm not privileged. I grew up poor. You even grew up poor. You stated that. And said, I struggle for everything I have. How is it I have privilege? If anything, black people have privilege. I said,
oh boy,
where do we find that privilege at? Because I want it. But could you explain to them what white privilege is, since they don't want to listen to at least a person like you say it?
Right. And that's one of the ironies of this work, right? Is that here I am as a white person, I get to be have the expertise on it. But the reality is that white people hear it better from other white people, right? You're going to get dismissed as biased, and I suppose I'm not, right? When I say I suppose I'm not, it's just kind of funny given the water that we're all swimming in, that white people think we're objective about race. I believe it's Pat Parker, who's an activist, who said, you give me any situation, you put some color on it, it'll be worse, right? So you're a person who uses a wheelchair, now be a black person in that wheelchair navigating social services. Not only you're dealing with the ableism of society, but you're also dealing with racism, right? So it's this huge struggle that you're literally not having to deal with if you're white. So yes, I grew up poor. And I did not have class advantage, but I absolutely have advantage as a white person. And I always knew that I was white. That is just one more struggle in life that I didn't have to face, right? So you can be disadvantaged in one area of life and still have privilege. We could look at you and say, well, you're able-bodied, so you do have the privilege in a society that's constructed for the able-bodied, right? You can easily access your building. You have privilege over people who have disabilities, right? And you still experience racism.
Correct. Now,
yes.
now, this is something that we noticed too. Why is it that white people get very uncomfortable when you bring up the discussion of race? Because, for instance, one time I was having a discussion, and we were discussing, race, and I noticed that the white people was getting all tensed up and looking like they were nervous. So I asked the guy, like, what you nervous for? I mean, what's the problem? He said, I just don't want to say anything that's offensive. Well, what are you going to say? Just have an opinion.
Yeah, I feel frustrated by that too. I mean, I suppose we could come up with reasons to understand it, but I think what we need to do as white people is ask ourselves, how does it function, right? Regardless of what my reasons are, how does it function when I play it safe and be careful and, don't take any risks, right? Does that create an authentic dialogue? Absolutely not. Does that build trust between us? Absolutely not, right? If I'm afraid of something I'm thinking is problematic, how will I ever find out so I can change it, right? All that is doing is protecting my bias or my assumptions, right? So it functions to simply hold everything in place. In my experience, you're going to trust me so much more. We're actually going to have a deeper, more authentic relationship if I'm willing to be honest and struggle with you about what false information I have. Pretending I don't have any is probably not convincing to you, right? So if I told you right now, oh, I am not racist in any way, I was taught to treat everyone the same, and my third cousin married a black man, and I've been to Costa Rica, would you be, okay, cool, she's down? No, you'd be like, oh my God, another clueless white progressive. Right? It's not convincing. I would imagine you'd rather me be honest about my fear, or so that we can talk it through.
Yeah, actually, that's one question I was definitely going to ask you, because a lot of times that's always prefaced to prove you're not racist. And usually when we as black people hear that, the red flag go off like, oh, Lord.
I know, right? That's what I always try to tell white people. One, we are the least qualified to assess whether we understand this, right? And so much of what we think is showing that we get it is actually not showing that at all, right? Yeah, in my presentations, I actually go through a lot of the common claims that white people make and kind of go under the surface and really examine them. So, for example, I was taught to treat everyone the same. I think that's probably the number one white claimed as evidence that we're not racist. And what I say to white folks is, no, you weren't. Straight up, you were not taught to treat everyone the same because it's not humanly possible. You can be told to do that. You can't teach human beings to be objective, right? So all you're doing when you say that is showing that you don't understand basic socialization and you're not self-aware. It's not convincing. You just simply can't, any more than I could tell you, don't judge, and now you can be free of judgment. It's not humanly possible.
And see, when I say the same things along the lines of what you're saying, oh boy, they have a fit.
I know.
They have a fit.
I know. Trust me. I'm amazed at what I can get away with. And that's another kind of piece of white privilege, right? Is that in a way, the very fact that I can say what I say is reinforcing, the white voice. And yet, if I can be heard, then I'm going to use it, right? To not use that position to speak truth to power is really problematic. So yes, I'm very sorry that you can't be heard the way I can, but I just,
I'm not worried about it at all, because my voice is loud as a lion. I don't care what they think. Let's talk about the next section. I want to get into the workforce. Now, why this is something that I've noticed, and other people can recognize this, on jobs. We notice that white people feel uncomfortable when people speak a different language, or when black people are grouping themselves together just to talk about the weather, their kids, and then you start looking at you like you're planning the next revolution or something. Why does this happen on jobs?
Well, maybe a couple reasons. One is we are not taught to see ourselves as white people. So that's like Beverly Tatum's wonderful book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Right? That's the title of her book. And the point is, well, where are all the white kids sitting then? Right? So I can gather around the cooler with my white friends day in and day out, and never see that in racial terms. As soon as you do it, now it's racialized, right? So that's one thing. And then it's just the entitlement to control everything, to speak for everyone, to be in charge. And now I don't have access to you. I don't know what you're talking about. And I mean, I know that sounds not very nice or complimentary, but at a very deep level, white people who grew up in this culture have a deeply internalized sense of superiority. There's no way you can miss the message that it's better to be white. No white person misses that message. We deny that we have that message, but we do, and it comes at us 24/7. So I'm inherently superior, and now you're gathering together, and I'm not in on it, controlling it, having access to what you do, and I feel some resentment that I can't actually admit to as resentment. So now I have to problematize you.
Now, what are the forms of workplace discrimination that we don't even know that's happening that's very subtle to people of color?
I think the ways that we sit around tables in which decisions are being made that affect everyone's life, and it's only white people making those decisions, right? Without any understanding of the impact or other voices or other perspectives. That's one way. Not building relationships, like authentic relationships in the workplace with people of color. Not truly wanting to diversify, right? So many organizations say we want more equity, and yet, gosh, we just keep not being able to get people of color in our workplaces, right? There's a lot going on there. The ways that we respond when race is brought up, right? The ways we want to get it off the table, kind of go silent about it, all of our sensitivity. So you're my coworker, and here's an example. Here, so there are two coworkers. One is a black woman, one is a white woman. And when the white woman would greet the black woman, she would say, "Hey, girl." She didn't say "hey, girl" to anybody else. She didn't say it to me. She would just say it to this black coworker, and it really bothered that coworker because she noticed she only says it to me. It's like when white people want to high five you, but they don't go to high five me, right? It's just without even thinking. As soon as I see that you're black, I begin to kind of relate to you differently, right? That draws your attention to that. And there's a deep history around calling black men and women girls and boys. Right?
Correct.
I mean, part of whiteness is we don't have to know our history. So this coworker went to the white woman and said, "I don't appreciate you calling me girl. I find it disrespectful, and you're not calling other people that." So that right there is actually, given the way these things often go, a rather brave moment. And then usually what happens is the white woman has hurt feelings, cries, becomes the victim. Everybody has to gather around her and comfort her, right? She withdraws and never talks to the black woman again. I'm sure you've seen these kinds of things. So, those are like kind of just the daily, like, slights and inability to talk openly about it without some kind of retaliation.
Yeah, because it's so many things on these jobs that we see, and it's just real, annoying. And that's why I want to definitely bring up the workforce with you. Let's speak a little bit about social justice. Now, this term, and a lot of these people, especially conservatives, use this term social justice warrior to, I noticed, a non-racist white person, and they say it was so vitriol and hatred when a person that's white that isn't racist are speaking for freedom, justice, and equality. Now, why is it they have so much hate for social justice warriors?
I mean, because they're challenging. I mean, in the same way that another dynamic that happens in the workplace is, so we hire you and we feel really good about ourselves. Look, we got you here. This just shows that we're all open and all of that. And you'll do fine and you'll get ahead as long as you don't challenge too many times, right? If you actually start bringing up racism and pointing it out, you're maybe going to get to do that once, but by the second time, you're going to be a problem. Right? You're going to be seen as a problem. So it's part of another way that it plays out in the workplace. And I think the social justice warriors is that these are white people that are breaking with white solidarity, right? So white solidarity is the unspoken agreement amongst white people that we'll keep each other comfortable around our racism, and we won't point it out, and we won't hold each other accountable, and we'll protect each other's privilege. Right? And so this social justice warrior, so-called, broke with white solidarity. Right? They actually are naming and calling in, and they're going to be punished in order to pull them back into not doing that anymore. There's a reason most white people, even when they recognize racism, they won't speak up about it, right? Because they don't want the social penalty. So the pressure to maintain white solidarity is really strong. And I think that's what happened. I think those white folks broke with white solidarity, and they're being punished. They're being bullied into being silent.
Yeah, because I have a lot of white people that'll come, they won't say it openly, but they'll come behind the scenes and say, hey, I really agree with you talking about, and, it's not right what happens in the country. But I'm like, okay, why don't you speak up?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. And I think awareness without action is kind of meaningless, right? So, yeah, great. Well, where were you in that meeting? You don't have my back. What difference does it? I mean, yes, on some level, it's nice to know that someone else saw it, but it doesn't mean anything if you're not going to speak up. And the reality is that white people can speak up about it with less consequence. It doesn't mean there isn't any consequence, but it's not the same as the consequence you're going to get. So I think that's a very disingenuous move to tell you offline that they agreed, but do nothing, publicly, and take no risks.
Correct. And we see that any Black person that speak up against white supremacy, racism, they become like just hated. I mean, how dare you speak up about this stuff? But when you see, our people being killed under the guise of this system, even the great so-called Dr. King that you said is so peaceful, yet if you read the letters that were sent to Dr. King, it's the same kind of hate. So is it they want to maintain white supremacy so much and oppress Black people so much that if you say anything, it's a problem?
Yeah, white supremacy and our investments in it make us irrational, right? And yeah, I don't know what else to say about that, right? Just it's kind of crazy making. We're deeply invested. We have a deep sense of internalized superiority that we could never admit to. We think that to have that would make us bad people. It's just this mix of confusing, conflicting knowledge and denial that makes us react very irrationally when called in on this kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a question. I noticed a lot of people in this society have a inherent fear, I notice now, of Black Lives Matter. And what is it with, I know some things I may not agree with Black Lives Matter here and there, but it is a fear. It is a just shaking in the boots. What is it about Black Lives Matter that just bother them?
Oh, yeah. And actually that reminds me of a piece of the previous question. There's a very deep resentment of Black people, connected to the shame of our history. It kind of this mix of shame and also righteousness, that we are correct and that we really are superior and that we should have treated you that way, right? So there's really, really deeply conflicted moral feelings. And so some of those messages, right, that really historical fear that Black people would uprise and basically kill slave masters, right? I mean, we vilified, we set messages up of Black men as sexual predators. I mean, there's just these deep narratives that are in the collective psyche, right? And so when you see anger, which of course is rational in the face of oppression, but when you see it, I think there's a very deep subconscious fear of that anger and that it will be turned on us. So Black Lives Matter, there's that fear. And there's also this, I mean, I hope you'll understand the intention with which I use this word, this uppityness, right? How dare you question this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard that word, anytime a Black person, articulate themselves well or speak against, white supremacy, you say, oh, he's uppity or she's uppity. But I never hear you say it about a white person if they say certain things. But the thing is, if you have a movie, for instance, coming out, Birth of a Nation, about the great Nat Turner, and I've had people tell me they were white, well, why is it they want to release that movie right now? Or racial tensions. I say, what, are you afraid that Black people gonna get motivated?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can look at what's happening now around the election, and I think this is a backlash from Obama's presidency, right? This uppityness that you would dare to be above me, right? That I would have to ever monitor, what I say and how I say it. And so it's kind of erupted. All of these things we've talked about that have been submerged have erupted. And now we're in a climate where there's space for that, right? Where there's validation to, it was always dog whistle politics up until now. And now it's not dog whistle at all. It's explicit. So yes, that taps into the outrage.
The Lee Atwater was the one that started that dog whistle politics. He at least explained it very well. Because we do a lot of reports on things that happen in America in the guise of race and police brutality. And, some of these same people that complain that, I present things like that, they be the main one wanting to attend it. Like, well, why do you watch it if you say you don't like when black people do certain things, or we talk about race too much? That's something that I just don't understand. And maybe you can help me understand that. Like, the thing they say they hate, they watch the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line is we have to protect what we see as our rightful positions, and we'll do whatever it takes, right? So getting different ways that we resist and push back so that basically the status quo can remain intact, because the racial status quo serves us.
Correct. Now, let me ask you about the another section real quick about the police. And this is something that I just noticed. There are people in white America that have almost a worship-like position for the police. Why do they take that position? Because I don't see no other people group acting that way about the police.
It's probably a thread of militarism. I mean, we also have a kind of a worship of veterans in our culture, right? It's also rooted in our own experiences as white people. Most white people have very positive experiences with police. So we just flat out don't believe that people of color, what you're telling us. Now we're seeing it with our own eyes, but there's an investment in not seeing it, because to really see it would challenge the social order, right? So we've got to believe that police are objective and good, and that nothing is happening, that isn't deserved, right? So it's a mix too. And there's also, like I said, there's a lot of deep prejudice against Black people in the culture that we can't admit to, but that is there. And so we believe there must be a good reason, because, you're inherently violent, and, all of these things.
Yeah, and it's funny that they say we inherently violent, yet we didn't put anyone in chattel slavery for 246 years. We didn't do Jim Crow for 100 years. We didn't continue slavery, as the 13th Amendment continued slavery. America's always had slavery. We ain't done any of that. But how are we inherently violent?
Right. No, I mean, it's a perversion of the true direction of historical violence, right? And particularly when white people talk about, I don't feel safe talking about race. I mean, seriously, using that word safe, in reference to a mere conversation, perverts the history, right, of lynching, torture, and enslavement, and imprisonment, and medical experimentation, right? I mean, hundreds of years of it. Yeah, it's frustrating, right?
And I'm glad you brought that up, because there'll be people that we talk about slavery. Well, you was never a slave, and I never owned a slave. So you guys have been over it already.
Yeah, I mean that's immature, and it's as if racism ended the day slavery ended, right? So that's just flat out ridiculous, and we don't know our history, right? So it's just a very uninformed, resentful dismissal. While I didn't set up the society I was born into, participating in it without challenging it keeps it going, right? I've benefited from the way it was set up, and I'm either challenging that or I'm participating in it, and there's no other option. The default of this society is to reproduce racial inequality, and it does it beautifully, and we all know it. By every single measure, this society reproduces racial inequality, and it has for hundreds of years. So our task is to figure out, okay, how is it doing it today? It's different than it was in the past, but it's still doing it. And what's my role? Because to not actively seek to challenge that is to collude with it.
Now we was talking about earlier about the police, and when we black people speak about it, they say well more white people are killed by the police than black people. Why don't they speak out against extrajudicial killings of white people? Wouldn't you think white people should be the leaders of the against police brutality movement, not black people? If they're killing more white people?
Yeah, boy, I'm not sure. But probably because we see each white person as an individual, and also it's not made visible to us, right? It's not made visible in the same way. But look, I think the heroin epidemic is a really great example, right? Suddenly, when all the white suburban kids are on heroin, we think we need to be more compassionate towards drug use, right? Because we see the humanity of our children, but we haven't seen the humanity of yours, and we haven't cared what happened.
Correct, because when the crack epidemic was happening, they're like, oh, let's lock them up, throw them in jail 30, 40 years.
Right, super predators.
There you go. Hillary. Oh boy, Hillary. But yeah, I know. I don't even want to get into them too, because I'm like, heaven help us all. Because I tell people I'd rather vote third party this time. I can't fool with them. But I have some people that before we wrap this up, have some questions from my Patreon. They ask you, what do you think about black people getting reparations for slavery? Do you think it will ever be given?
Well, brilliant people such as Ta-Nehisi Coates have written very, very clearly about, how and why and all of that. And so, yes, I support it. And I'm sorry to say I'm a bit cynical about it actually happening.
Yeah, because the way these people are, it just, but the funny part is we have to watch everybody else get reparations. The Japanese got reparations.
I know.
Jewish people got reparations for the Holocaust, and the Holocaust didn't happen here. Native Americans, they deserve it. They get, because they suffered a lot, but yet we don't get a thing. Now, shoot, you can't even make us tax free.
Well, in fairness, I think Native Americans are still fighting very, strongly for their treaty rights and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's something so anti-black in this society. I just have to say it. There's something so anti-black that runs so deep in the white psyche.
Ask you a question. When we use a lot of people, I even asked Jane Elliott the same question. A lot of white people identify themselves as Christian, correct?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. So why is it that, if Jesus said the description of a devil is someone that kills, steals, and destroys, why do they get very upset when you describe what they do as being a devil?
Well, it's connected to the denial and the idea, again, white people think whatever's at the very front of my mind, whatever I'm consciously aware of is all that's happening. And so if you just called me a devil, you said that I want to hurt you, I mean to hurt you. And I'm in deep denial about that. So I'm just going to respond as if you've just deeply insulted me.
That's just one term I noticed. I think that's almost bad as the N-word for black people.
Yeah. It's kind of funny, right? It's like if you said to me, Robin, you're a murderer, I would laugh, right? Because it's like, yeah, whatever. I'm not a murderer, and I know I'm not a murderer. So that does nothing. You say, Robin, you're a racist. We go crazy with defensiveness. It's so interesting, right? Like as if I really, really, truly to the core believed I wasn't, then I would just laugh that off, right? Because it had no meaning to me. So there's something going on there that we, that's like the worst thing you can call a white person. And all that does is function to protect racism. I don't know how this will come across, but, on behalf of white people, really, I apologize. I mean, for our nonsense, and I just know that some of us, I'm out here, I've devoted my life to waking my people up and helping us stop the nonsense. So onward and upward.
Well, Robin, now you done messed up. Now you have white guilt.
Yeah, I think it should be really obvious that I don't feel guilty. I often will say that I don't feel guilty. I'm not a disempowered person, but I do feel responsible. I do believe that to not intentionally and actively seek to interrupt racism is to support racism. It's Howard Zinn talks about there's no neutral position on a moving train. The society reproduces racism. So to not try to challenge that is to collude with it. And that's not a matter of guilt for me. It's a matter of responsibility.
Now, have you ever met Jane Elliott or spoken to her?
Oh, no, but I kind of worship her. I have a deep respect and admiration for her, and I personally love her anger. She's righteously angry. It's hard not to be angry when day in and day out you got to look right in the face of this, right? Because you're directly challenging it. And I know a lot of people have trouble with how intense she is, but there's a point where you just say, knock it off.
Yeah, because I interviewed her a few months, I think in June or so, and I mean she is on it. Now, one thing she did say, and basically what you were saying earlier about you being a woman, a white woman, she said only a white woman could speak this message because more people will accept it from a white woman than a white man. And I thought that was very interesting that she said that.
I'm not sure, because I think a white man is the ultimate at the top of the hierarchy, right? So I might be white, but I do have sexism, going against me. And so, we know from research that male professors are rated more highly than female professors, etc. Right? And so the ultimate voice that's legitimized in our society is a white male voice. And so when white men do use that, I think it can be really powerful, but notice that there are very, very few.
Well, Dr. Robin, I definitely want to thank you for joining us today and sharing a lot of knowledge. And how can people contact you?
Oh, on my website, robindiangelo.com.
All right, everyone. Well, make sure you contact Dr. Robin if you have any questions, or make sure to purchase her books as well on Amazon.com. So, Dr. Robin, thank you for taking your time to speak to us.
Oh, thank you. It was an honor. Thank you.